back like I never left. Finally, we get somebody who can tell Luffy things just like it is. Because now I keep coming back to the chapter just to see the way Luffy reacts to Gaban in this chapter. Look, Luffy gets disrespected all the time. Kaido talked down to him. The admirals talk down to him like a kid. Half of the villains in this series always tell him he has no business trying to become Pirate King. Usually Luffy does not care. But Gaban grabs this man by the neck, calls him a disappointment, basically tells him he's not acting like somebody ready to become Pirate. And Luffy actually sits there thinking about it. That bothered him. And I think I know why. Gaban isn't an enemy trying to crush Luffy's dream. We already know that. He's one of the few people alive who actually knows what it's like to stand beside the Pirate King. And once I started looking at it that way, Gaban's conversation with Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji started to feel connected. Because this isn't the first time somebody from Roger's era has shown up at exactly the right time of Luffy's journey and taught him something he wasn't ready to understand before. Shanks did it, Rayleigh did it, and now Gaban is doing it. Except the lesson this time isn't how to become stronger. It's what happens when everyone around you starts depending on that strength. See, Shanks gave Luffy something to chase. And you can go all the way back to every chapter with Shanks, right? When Luffy met him, he knew nothing. No Haki, no Grand Line, no Yonko. He just saw this pirate who somehow looked freer than anyone else in the world. And Shanks taught him a lot without ever officially becoming his teacher. He couldn't let somebody embarrass him in a bar and laugh it off, but threaten his friends and suddenly everything changes. Then obviously Shanks loses his arm saving Luffy. And here's the part I didn't really connect to Gaban at. Luffy knew Shanks saved him, obviously, but Luffy was a little kid. He was young. There was no way he fully understand what it meant for someone like Shanks to give up an arm because he thought this kid's future was worth protecting. Now jump all the way to chapter 1190 and Luffy isn't 7 anymore. He's an emperor now. He's beaten Kaido. He's awakened his devil fruit. People are literally looking at this man like a symbol of liberation. And now another person connected to Roger loses an arm, keeping Luffy alive. Except this time, Luffy is old enough to understand exactly what he's watching. Shanks' sacrifice happened when Luffy could not do nothing about it. Gaban's happened when Luffy is supposed to be one of the people strong enough to prevent it. And I think that is why this one might hurt differently. Now let's talk about what Rayleigh taught Luffy. Rayleigh taught Luffy that wanting it isn't enough. See, Rayleigh meets Luffy at a completely different stage. By Sabaody, Luffy has a dream. He has the crew. He has enough confidence for 3 lifetimes. But then everything falls apart. He cannot protect anyone. One by one, the Straw Hats disappear in front of him, and Luffy has no answer. Then Marineford takes basically that same lesson and makes that worse. Luffy wants to save Ace more than anything. He pushes his body beyond anything reasonable and still loses him. So when Rayleigh finally becomes Luffy's mentor, he doesn't need to teach Luffy to believe in himself. That has never been Luffy's problem. Rayleigh has to teach Luffy something way harder. Stop. You're not ready. Take 2 years, right? Learn Haki. Become strong enough that when you enter the new world, everybody else's survival isn't based on you getting lucky. And Luffy actually listens. Like, that is why I love what Gaban is doing right now. Because in a weird way, he's telling Luffy you're not ready again, except this time there's no 2-year time skip. Imu's already there. Elbaf is already in danger. Luffy is already an emperor. Rayleigh could basically tell him, take your time and prepare. Gaban's version is, yo, you don't have that luxury anymore. That is a much more nastier lesson. But Luffy is playing at a much higher level now. And that is why I don't think Gaban is just calling Luffy weak in 1190. That would be kind of ridiculous anyway. Luffy is obviously strong. Gaban is actually questioning whether Luffy understands what his position means now. Luffy basically responds with, I'm not gonna die, right? I'm not dying. And Gaban is like, okay, I got you. What if you do though? What happens to your crew? What happens to Elbaf? What happens to everyone who has connected their futures to yours? That is something Luffy doesn't normally think about, right? He just jumps to it and then he's gone. He's always been reckless. But before, Luffy doing something stupid usually meant Luffy getting hurt. Now he's a Yonko. If he gets himself killed, the consequences spread way beyond him. And this is where Scopper Gaban's conversation with Zoro and Sanji suddenly stopped feeling random to me, right? Gaban Gaban hasn't just been watching Luffy, he's been checking the people around him too. Almost like he's looking at this crew and asking, if this idiot really is going to become Pirate King, are all three of you ready for what that actually requires? Look at Zoro. Gaban brings up Conqueror's Haki and basically makes the point that having this kind of power is one thing, understanding it is another. It has to be tamed. And I think that says a lot about how Scopper Gaban looks at strength. Potential doesn't impress him by itself. You have to know what you're carrying. And honestly, that applies to Luffy too. Luffy has Gear 5, Conqueror's Haki, an Emperor title, right? A fleet, all these nations that trust him. But does Luffy completely understand the weight of all that yet? Probably not. Then there's Sanji. Scopper Gaban reminds him that his captain is an emperor now. If you're going to have this man's back, you have to be meticulous. And then in this chapter, chapter 1190, it makes that line so much better because Gaban demonstrates it himself. Luffy goes down. Imu is trying to finish dude. Gaban steps in directly between them while he's already injured and eventually loses an arm doing it. So he didn't just tell Sanji what it means to have an emperor's back. He just showed him. That is why I think Scopper Gaban is teaching these three different pieces of the same thing. Zoro has to become strong enough and control enough to stand beside a king. Sanji has to become somebody the king can trust behind him when everything goes wrong. And Luffy has to understand that these people are going to risk their lives for it. He can't just keep treating that like it comes free with being a captain, right? And then there's another layer here that honestly is just funny. Remember when they were talking about Roger's strongest man and putting Roger first, Rayleigh second, and Gaban third? Y'all remember that? And then Gaban basically objected. This man was half dead and still found enough life to say, hold on, second strongest, okay? Now that is Gaban's claim. I'm not getting involved in this Rayleigh versus Scopper Gaban civil war. You people can fight amongst yourselves. Y'all can fight amongst yourselves. It tells you something about these guys. Roger had monsters underneath him with their own pride and probably their own ridiculous competition. Then Gaban meets Zoro and Sanji, two monsters, both insanely loyal to Luffy, both constantly arguing, both trying to make sure that they're strong enough to carry their side of the crew. I genuinely wonder if Gaban sees these two and recognizes their dynamic. Like, this man probably watched Zoro and Sanji argue and thought, damn, Roger really did start another one, right? And I'm not just saying Zoro is Rayleigh 2.0 and Sanji is Gaban 2.0. I actually think forcing those one-to-one comparisons make it less interesting. It's about the role. Roger could not become Pirate King alone, and neither can Luffy, which is something Gaban understands better than almost anyone alive. Do you guys remember when Gaban got that name Mountain Eater, or the reputation Mountain Eater? Roger was injured. Enemies came for him. Gaban went out there, protected his captain, and apparently the forest became casualty. Now look at chapter 1190. Luffy is seriously injured. Imu is trying to kill him. Scopper Gaban steps in and Treasure Tree Adam starts getting chopped into firewood. This man's emergency response has not changed in decades. Captain down, protect captain. Declare war on vegetation. But like, seriously, that callback makes his scolding hit even harder. When Gaban asks Luffy what happens to his crew if he dies, Gaban knows what it's like to become the crew member in that situation. He knows what it feels like when your captain cannot fight and suddenly keeping that man alive becomes your responsibility. So this isn't some old guy giving Luffy a speech about leadership. He lived it. He did this for the Pirate King. He did this for Roger. And now he's doing it for Luffy. That is probably why Luffy can't just shrug that insult off, right? Kaido tells Luffy he is enjoyable. Fight Kaido. Some villains say he will never become Pirate King. Luffy has heard that 1,000 times. But one of Roger's old men basically tells him, you're disappointing me right now. That hits somewhere else. And almost immediately, Luffy is sitting there trying to force his body to heal so he can get back up. We can talk about what that healing means in another video, but for this discussion, the important thing is simpler. Gaban got through to him. So, what is the lesson Luffy couldn't learn until now? Because this is where I think all of everything I've spoken about or talked about so far comes together. Shanks meets Luffy when all he really had was the dream. Rayleigh met him when that dream had grown way beyond his actual strength. Gaban meets him after he becomes an emperor. Luffy has the strength now. The issue is what that strength means to everybody standing behind him. Think Rayleigh. Nurarion. He had to carry his crew's powers on his back so he could use them. Basically talking about him protecting his crew in a different kind of way, right? That is why this lesson couldn't happen earlier. You can't teach a 7-year-old Luffy what the responsibility of being a Yonko feels like. You can't teach pre-time skip Luffy how to carry a Pirate King's crew when he hasn't or he can't even protect the crew from Kizaru. And now Luffy is getting close enough that these things matter. Zoro can't just have incredible haki. He's going to need mastery. Sanji can't just be strong. He has to be somebody Luffy can trust with his life. And Luffy can't just keep saying, don't worry, I won't die. Like that solves anything. Because whether he realizes it or not, people are betting their lives on this guy. Shanks already did. Rayleigh invested years into him, and now Scopper Gaban loses an arm right in front of him, his left arm. And that is why I don't think this chapter, One Piece chapter 1190, is just an old legend roasting Luffy because he lost the fight. I think Scopper Gaban is looking at Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji and making sure that the core of this crew understands what becoming the Pirate King's crew is actually going to demand from them. And after everything Luffy has learned from Roger's generation, this might be the lesson he needed the most. Not another transformation, right? Not another attack. Not somebody telling him his dreams is possible. Luffy already knows that. What he needed was somebody who stood behind Roger or stood beside Roger to look him in the face and say, if you're going to become that man, understand what everybody around you is going to sacrifice to get you there. And after watching Gaban pay that price himself, I really want to see what Luffy does when he gets back up, right? Because eventually the old generation has to stop saving Luffy. And chapter 1190 might be the moment Luffy finally realizes